আচ্ছা আচ্ছা
ফ্যাকাল্টিরা পাবে না, না বাইরে ওদের কিছু Okay, so today now the second lecture, Professor Sansina. So he will talk on the quantum dots and the synthesis applications. Then
okay. Is everybody in here or there are still people out?
still, most of them are there.
Most. Okay. Okay, morning. So yesterday we had in the introduction lecture where we basically got introduced to what nanotechnology is, why properties of material behave differently when you suddenly shrink their size. Then we also talked about in the next lecture the application of nanotechnology in the field of biology, which we call as nanobiotechnology. So today we are going slightly more deep into the nanotechnology area. So we would split the lecture up into 3 parts. Actually, there are 2 parts are put in together. So of the 3 parts, the first part what we are talking is on quantum dots. So quantum dots is the 0 dimensional nanomaterial. We talked about quantum dots yesterday in the introduction. So today we would talk a little more on quantum dots and especially how it is used in the field of biology. Quantum dots is actually one of the devices which is used for imaging purposes in medicine. We have I will show you how it's used for imaging and also for finding out drug delivery. So we will talk about that. The next lecture is a combination of 1 dimensional nanomaterials. So there we would go a little more into carbon nanotube, what we talked about yesterday. So we will talk more about how to make carbon nanotube or how carbon nanotubes are used. We will talk first part of that lecture is divided actually into 3 parts. The first part is about carbon nanotube because that is the material which actually is what made nanotechnology kind of famous. So we will talk about carbon nanotubes. The next part we will talk a little bit about some nanowires, primarily silicon. Then we would talk about the other material of carbon which is right now has actually overshadowed carbon nanotubes, that is graphene. So the second lecture would be on nanotubes and nanowire and graphene, and the third part I do not think we would be able to cover today, though even it is kind of loaded here. We would talk about that maybe not maybe, I think definitely in our lecture tomorrow. That is basically devices made out of carbon nanotube and graphene. So we would talk about electronic devices like transistors and other, when you do measurements with carbon nanotube as sensors or any other way when you try to detect signals. So how carbon nanotubes or graphenes are used as electronic devices. So that is the last part of that lecture. There is a researcher at IBM lab known as Professor Alvasteros. He has done pioneering work with the carbon nanotube based sensing, and most of the papers or work we would talk about is from his research. Okay, so again when we talk about synthesis and applications, I talked with a few of you in between yesterday and today, and I found out some of you were trying to use new techniques of doing the synthesis to make nanomaterials, or starting from quantum dots to nanotubes, anything, and that is very, very welcome. Any one of you, do you know what is the price of a gram of say carbon nanotube? How much is the price? You do not have to buy it. So if some are, if you are faculty or students who know actually the price of carbon nanotube, carbon nanotube, again I would give you the price in dollars, which is the price which I am more familiar with. When I started my research in carbon nanotubes in the early 2000s, the price of carbon nanotube was about $500 a gram. From there the price have come down, still it is $30 a gram. Just to give you an idea, the price of gold, if you try to look, gold price is I think in the order of about $40 to $50 a gram. So, carbon nanotube is not very much cheap compared to that of gold. Again, other nanomaterials, if you want to order gold nanomaterials or anything else, the price still is reasonably high. That is something that is preventing a large scale use of nanomaterials because of its high price. Again, the downside is you do not use a ton of nanomaterials. 1 gram is sufficient, maybe you use a few grams because you are making it for sensors, you are making it for other purposes which do not need a lot of materials. So, but still if you can find, yes, come on. So, again if you try to find out why the price of these materials are high, the reason is the processes are complicated. How do we make it? And the current processes what we will be talking about, they are all lab based processes which can be done in the lab. Like 1 gram of material is very easy to do in the lab. If you are a chemical engineer, you would know that to go from 1 gram to a 1 ton, the process has to be totally redeveloped, and that hasn't been able to, people haven't been able to do that in a large scale. I think for carbon nanotube there are some places where they have been trying to do it in large scale. They have to make it the other nanomaterial which is kind of sold in large quantities is titanium dioxide. There are plants where we make large quantities of titanium dioxide, because titanium dioxide, any one of you know where it is used for? Paints, right. It is basically a main component of white paint, whitewash paint, titanium dioxide, and in fact if you use titanium dioxide you can keep your rooms cool, also generate voltage. By titanium dioxide is a photo sensitive material, so you can generate like a solar cell, you can generate voltage out of from there. Anyway, that is the only material which can be made in large scale. So, I encourage you to try out biological methods or other means to make, if you are trying to do to make this the nanoparticles, nanomaterials, because one of the main problems of nanomaterials is how to keep them in the nano form. Once you make it in the nano form, how do you keep it, because if you have to sell it to other people to use it, it still has to be in the nano form, and that is why most of the places it is used in the nano form is it's sold as a suspension or a dispersion on a liquid water. It's put it in a, but it's not, sometimes it is not easy to keep it separate. There is some chemistry, especially electrochemistry involved in how to keep the materials in. So, that is why again any one of you who have done a purchase, you would see that if you want to buy a powder form of any nanomaterial versus a solution form, there is almost a factor of 3 difference in the price, because the companies who make the nanomaterials like Sigma Aldrich or something, who want to make it in the suspension form, they have to spend extra effort to kind of do that, and that is why. So, if you make it in the biological way, it would be easier to do it. The main reason is most of the biological materials are soluble in water. So, that would kind of eliminate the second possibility. And again sometimes you cannot use the nanomaterials primarily because it is suspended in alcohol or acetone or something else, which you cannot directly transfer it to cells or any biological object. So, that is also an issue. Okay, so the reason I wanted to say it is, when I say synthesis, that is not this is what the synthesis techniques, because it was developed from physical sciences. So, the synthesis I will talk about is the physical sciences method of synthesis. There could be other ways, and means biological methods has in the introduction I showed you there are certain bacteria which can be used for making nanomaterials. So, that research is ongoing. So, that is not included in over here. And again what I told yesterday, please feel free to ask me questions and interrupt me. I would be that kind of makes me feel that you are understanding what we want to do. So, this would be introduction. We will talk about, yesterday we talked about quantum confinement. We would talk a little bit more about the quantum confinement, how you can increase the quantum confinement. We would talk about the different methods of doing quantum dot synthesis, and then we will talk about the applications. We will talk about biological applications, and then also some applications where it is used as light emitters, which is also related to biological applications. So, again we all know what a quantum dot is. Again, can I ask you the question, how is it different from a nanoparticle? We talked about it yesterday. Are all nanoparticles quantum dots? So, what is a quantum dot? What qualifies a nanoparticle to be a quantum dot? Yes, louder please. 3-dimensional quantum confinement, but let's say I make one of the nanoparticles which is widely used or it is available in nature is silicon dioxide, sand is silicon dioxide. So, if you sand is not nanoparticle, but if you break it up you can make nanoparticles of silicon dioxide. Is silicon dioxide a quantum dot? Or titanium dioxide, what we talked about? Why is it not? It is a 0-dimensional nanoparticle. So, what makes something quantum dot? Again this 3-dimensional quantum confinement is you have to do experiments to kind of find it out, but straight away from the name you would be able to identify whether it is a quantum dot or not. The main difference is most quantum dot materials are, most or I would say 100% of them are semiconductors. That is the, again silicon dioxide is also a semiconductor. If you know, silicon dioxide is what we call a wide band gap semiconductor or something insulator. So, something which has a wide band gap semiconductor does not have this 3-dimensional quantum confinement, because I will tell you the reason why shortly. So, something which is a semiconductor which has a reasonable band gap, that will be qualifying as quantum dot, because we would be using that band gap to do all the functions of. And so, here we have gallium arsenide quantum dot. Our whole point of making quantum dots, we would talk about that is as we make the material smaller, then like this one is this is not a real one, but it says it has only 465 atoms. So, if you can make the quantum dot smaller, you will see that is one of the reasons why quantum dots are used, is the light that comes out. Quantum dot, why is it used? We talked about yesterday, when it gets in light it luminesces, it takes, I will talk about that a little more detail, it gives out a light of a certain frequency. Now, that frequency, that emitted light that comes out from, that depends on the number of atoms or the size. So, as the quantum dots shrink or expand, the color it comes out will change, and it is all in the visible range. So, it will change from blue to red. If the quantum dot changes from blue to red, you would know that its size has either grown or shrunk depending upon what material it is, and that is something which is used a lot for biological detection, because if you are detecting something, you want something to come and get attached to it. So, when it gets attached to it, what happens is its size becomes bigger, and immediately you see a change in color. Okay, so, quantum dots regarded as semiconductors by definition. So, silicon, because of its structure, is the most popular semiconductor, but it does not form quantum dots. Why not? Because of its bond structure and all, silicon does not form a 0-dimensional material. Silicon forms a nanowire. So, silicon forms nanowire. Carbon does not form. So, there has to be another condition that has to satisfy, is it has to be forming a 0-dimensional structure. If there is again it is related to the periodic table. if you look at the group, which group carbon is? Group 4, isn't it? Anyway, I call it group 4, which is carbon, is the element which is just below carbon is silicon. The element which is below silicon is germanium. These three materials, all of them are semiconductors up to a certain level. Silicon is the best, germanium is also semiconductor, but those three things do not form quantum dots because they have a type of hybridization. Carbon has the different types of hybridization, you know, sp2, sp3. Silicon also has a kind of that, germanium also have that, which makes you cannot make it into a small, it becomes a long structure. Okay. So, all semiconductors are not quantum dots, that is what I wanted to say. All nanoparticles are not quantum dots, all semiconductors are not quantum dots. The semiconductors which can form a 0 dimensional structure, those are the only ones which are quantum dots, and most of them are what we call as compound semiconductors. Compound semiconductors means it is a combination between elements of two groups, group 2 and 6 or 3 and 5 or 4 and 6 materials. That means cadmium selenide, indium antimonide, means it is a compound material, it does not, it is not made up of a single element. Silicon, germanium, those are made up of single element. It also, there are people who are working trying to make quantum dots by combination of more than 2. There are quantum dots where there is 3 elements involved in making quantum dots. They can play with this. This is an area where what we call as tunable band gap. So, quantum dots where the band gap can be changed and dependent upon the size. Again, as you know, if you change the band gap or if you change the size, what happens is the frequency of light that comes out from there is changes. It would be, the best would be if the light that comes out is in the visible range. Unfortunately, our visible range in the entire spectrum is very small. Anybody knows what is the visible range? So, about 500 nanometer or 5000 angstroms to maybe up to 8000 or angstroms, or 500 nanometers to 800 nanometers. So, it is only in this range, and most of the biological applications what we try to do is we would try to get it in this range, and the way we can do is we can make the quantum dot. The quantum dot has the advantages, we can make, this is where the nanomaterial come in, is we can tune or change the band gap. Silicon has a band gap of 1.1 electron volt, if you know, and that is fixed. Silicon, you cannot change the band gap. Silicon, and one of the reason silicon is a very popular semiconductor for every application other than as an optical sensor. The reason is, if you convert that 1.1 electron volt into frequency, you would see that, I think you know how to convert the energy into frequency by using the Planck's number E equal to h times. If you convert that into frequency, you would be finding the frequency or the wavelength of light that comes out would be not in the visible range. So, that is one of the main issues with silicon, and we could not do anything with the band gap of silicon. So, that is why it is not used as a optical sensor. The element which is used more as an optical sensor wherever you have is gallium or gallium arsenide, because that has a band gap which is in the visible range. But if you work with germanium also has that, but the problem with germanium is it is not an easy material to work with. Silicon, you can etch silicon, you can do lot of lithography processes on silicon. The reason you can do that on silicon is because if you keep silicon out, it forms an oxide layer on the top, and so once you can remove the oxide layer, you can do, if you want to etch or make a pattern on silicon, you do not want the whole silicon surface to be exposed. So, you can do that Germanium on the other hand does not form a stable oxide. You cannot make germanium oxide a very stable compound. So, that is why any germanium it is difficult to make, but you have to do it. In nanomaterials, what you can do is you can do quantum dots, you can do band gap tunable. Also, if you make silicon smaller in size, why people use silicon nanowires is when you make silicon small, then that 1.1 electron volt band gap can be changed, and that is one of the reasons we people use silicon nanowire. That is one which is used as optical sensor. But in the added advantage with this again with quantum dots is the band gap changes with size, and this is nothing abnormal for most of the nanomaterials. The properties scale with size. So, when you say some property, say we say copper is a conductor, in a nanomaterial we would say nano copper is so in this price to this size. If the size changes, the property would also be changing. So, what is quantum confinement? Quantum confinement, as it says, is what happens is electrons are free to move. If electrons are not put in any pressure, any potential, electrons would move. We remember when we were doing the introduction, we solved quantum mechanics, the Schrodinger equation. The Schrodinger equation was a kind of way of writing the conservation of energy. We write the kinetic energy is equal to something. Then when we write that, if you work with a free electron, means if you just keep an electron free, it can have all sorts of energies. But even after that, when we do the quantum calculation, we found out that the energy is not actually totally continuous. As we go down, the energy goes up in steps. But when we put quantum confinement, that means we are putting the electron inside a potential. That means we are taking a person or out from the outside, or basically we are taking an animal or a bird and putting it in a cage. Electron can be thought like a bird, free electron, which can fly around everywhere. So, when you try to find, it is good for solving equations, but it is not good for predicting anything, because you do not know where it is going to be. So, that is why we put the electrons inside a potential, and based on that then we know the probability of the things staying inside. And what type of potential they are? If you confine it in one dimensional, they are what is known as quantum well. Quantum well is, it is like a well where the potential at a certain place is 0, where you are, if you look at a well, it is two sides are higher and then one side is lower. So, if you plot the potential energy as a function of distance, that is what the graph looks like, which means that the potential everywhere else is higher, and the thing inside would be less. It is like putting something inside a room. So, that is what is known as a quantum well. If you do two dimensional confinement, quantum well is one dimensional, it is only one dimensional. Room will not be a correct way, because room is two dimensional. If you put more two dimensional, it becomes quantum wire, and if you make three dimensional, it is basically, it can go in all three directions. So, that is what we call it a quantum dot. Okay. So, that is where the confinement is. So, that is why when we say in quantum dot, the material is confined in all three directions or three dimensions. So, again quantum confinement can happen in other places. When we talk about nanowires, carbon nanotubes, we will tell you where quantum confinement is occurring, and we would talk about that. So, but for 0 dimensional materials, they are more prominent, because we can see you need materials which has an energy band gap, which means that the energy electrons have a certain, all electrons have a certain energy up to a certain level. Then when you shine some light or put in some energy, it has to go to the next level, and it needs some amount of energy to jump to the next level before it starts exhibiting. So, that is what we would be seeing as in quantum gap. if this gap is not there, if there is a continuous change, we would not be able to see it as a detector. Detector would work is when there is no color, suddenly it starts turning green, but if it gradually changes from colorless to gradually goes over to green change, that would, when there is no quantum confinement, gradual change, we will not be able to detect which point it actually has changed. So, that is why we need that sudden change, and for that sudden change we need there has to be a high enough energy gap, so we can see the. So, again quantum confinement is only observed at dimensions below 2 nanometers. There are calculations where we can show them based on their 2 nanometers, but those calculations are all based upon models which are holding the electrons together. Okay. So, those are after the fact calculations, means when we know the effect is 2 nanometers, you can fit the data and they have done it calculations. We do not know exactly why this is around 2 nanometers. One way you can, again we can get the idea is if you make the thing bigger, volume becomes more prominent, and so the surface area to volume ratio changes. So, there is, and I would think I was talking to somebody yesterday, the quantum properties or the nano properties to the bulk properties, there is not a gradual shift. There is quantum properties are up to a certain level, then there is a paradigm shift, then suddenly you see the bulk properties. That means when the volume comes into the picture, then suddenly the entire property changes, and after that it remains the same as we are talking about. So, when we make something small, say you are looking at something's melting point. If the melting point, say we know for silicon, for matter, the melting point of silicon is that number I remember, it is 1400 degrees. So, silicon is 1400 degrees. If you want to make silicon smaller, it still remains 1400. Then suddenly in one point when it becomes nano, then it drops from 1400 to 1100, and then as you make it smaller, it keeps going down, scaling down with the size. So, there is a one point where there is a sudden change. For all nanomaterials, there is a sudden change where suddenly the properties change from the bulk to the nano form, and here that happens to be when the size is in the order of 2 nanometers. So, this is what we are talking about. This is the atomic model, Bohr model, where you have the nucleus and you have the electrons circulating around. This diagram is expressed in another way by doing the energy. When the electron is at this level, it has a certain energy. When the electron is this level, it has a certain energy, and since electrons only orbit in certain circles, any electron cannot stay in between these two circles, and so similarly any electrons cannot stay, and these lines basically designate what is the energy of one of these circles. So, that is why this is what we call the energy level diagram. So, when when an electron jumps from this level to this level, then that is what is known as changing, exciting, and changing the level. Also here we would talk about, since it is semiconductor, we would talk about something known as a hole. Do you know what is a hole? It is another way of saying, for example, in this room there are so many people, and when one person comes in, we say that one electron has come in. Now, if one person leaves, then the another way of saying it is the absence. So, when it is already filled with electrons and one leaves, then instead of talking about, we have to calculate it everything for all the electrons and then find what person going out, what we would say is by looking at what how much is leaving. Every country has different grading systems. If you have ever studied the German education system, the German education system is, if you get a 0 in a subject, that means you have scored the highest point, because their education system, the grades are calculated like holes. So, 0 means you have made no mistakes, 1 means you have made 1 mistake, 2 means you have got 2 mistakes, and there if you get 100, it means you have actually done nothing, you have got. So, the holes, that is another way of saying how you are calculating holes. So, in German they calculate holes, while here or most rest of the world we calculate electrons. So, that you can think of two ways of looking at it. Or if anybody who has played the game of golf would know that golf is you more points you get, actually worse you are performing, because the points are all penalty points. So, this is the entire energy level, and I am just amplifying and showing these two levels over here. We are amplifying that, and in general, if there are a large number of, like this is one atom, then this is another atom, then this is another atom. So, if there are more of them, then you would be having these type of energy levels would be next to each other, and you would find out they will not be exactly coinciding. Even you have an atom next to there, this energy of this electron may be slightly more than the next to the other one. So, what you would be getting is, instead of getting one line, you would be getting a number of these lines. Each line corresponds to the energy level of one atom. The next atom is, say, this line corresponds to the energy level of atom 1, this line corresponds to the energy level of atom 2, atom 3. So, if there are more number of atoms, what would happen is it would be almost continuous. That is why if you have a large material which is more than 2 nanometers, say if you make it say a micron scale material, then what you would be having is these layers would kind of come and almost there would be no energy gap. The energy gap would be, so that is why you would not be able to see the quantum effect. Now, if you make it smaller, you are restricting the number of atoms. You might ask the question, why do we use 465 atoms? Why do not we do it with one atom? Again, if you want to do it with one atom, there is, say ideally you would have the technique of making it to one atom. First, there is a practical consideration, you will not be able to make it to one atom, but even if you could get it to one atom, theoretically you would not be able to make a quantum dot with one atom. Why? I gave the answer yesterday. Yeah, it is known as uncertainty. Okay. So, if you make it with one atom, you would not be sure that the one atom would be making the quantum dot, because the probability of that would, we have to find out, and that would be you would not be you make it with one atom, but you are not sure where that atom is actually inside that quantum whatever the quantum dot you have made it or not. Okay. So, there is a trade off. So, because of uncertainty, you cannot reduce it from 465 down to 1. Again, why 465? That is just an arbitrary number. Maybe you can reduce it up to 40 or up to 50 or something, where still the probability does not play enough, where you have the probability of the electron, most of the electrons kind of lying inside the space where you have looked out. So, now if you have more than, if you have instead of 465, if you have say 4 trillion atoms, then you will not be having any of these. And so, that is why we have to have less numbers, so that if these, and again then this becomes what we call as band. Instead of being an energy level, then they become, these are what we call as bands, and then this is, then we call it, it is actually a gap of energy, but we call it a band gap. It is little more complicated than that. I would not talk about that more. Actually, for lattice materials, even for nanomaterials, for quantum dot it is not a problem, because it is 3 dimension, it is like a sphere, but for 1 dimensional materials there are these energy gaps or energy levels are different along different directions, because you know when you make a lattice you have atoms placed next to other, so the forces are not the same along all the directions, along certain directions. And in carbon nanotube, graphene, these are materials which are highly anisotropic, that means along one direction one property. So, it might have an energy gap like this along one direction, in another direction it will not have any energy gap. For example, when we talk about graphene, graphene is a material which kind of looks strange, we would talk about that in a minute. It is known as a zero band gap semiconductor. So, graphene is a semiconductor, but it does not have an energy gap. Okay. We will talk about that later. Okay. So, this is what we call, that is why we say this is very famous of a particle in a box, that is what we just talked about, the uncertainty principle. Therefore, more spatially confined localized particles become broad and the range of momentum and energy, that means you cannot make what I just now said. Then this is the increase. So, if you have to increase the average energy, it is equal to the increased level of the spacing. So, larger is the band gap. So, if you can make the band gap more, that would be your quantum dot would be more efficient, because you would be seeing a larger change, and larger change you would be seeing is be reflected by the change in frequency of the light that would be operating from there. There are calculations which say the band gap of a spherical quantum dot is from the bulk by increased by a factor of 1 over r squared. Again, r is the radius of it. So, as you make the radius more, then this becomes the band gap of it goes down, because 1 over r squared, r becomes more, it becomes a smaller number. So, so the quantum dots are band gap tunable by size. So, we have known that smaller quantum dots have a large band gap. Absorbance and luminescence spectrum are blue shifted with the decreasing particle size. Blue shifting means it shifted to the towards the blue wavelength. So, this is a quantum dot, a larger quantum dot. Oops. So, when the energy gap, when it jump, if you convert that into wavelength, it comes around 555 nanometers, say with this. If you make it smaller, then the making it smaller means the energy gap increases, and energy gap increasing means, again, if you know E equal to hc over lambda, that equation, from there you are calculating the wavelength. So, larger energy means, so that will correspond to, so that would be, so if for some reason you had the quantum dot of this size, you made it bigger by absorbing something, then you would be seeing the light change from blue to red, or if it goes the other way, you would be observing that. That is one of the ways it is used. We will talk about that. It is used for tumor detection. Quantum dots are targeted to get into a certain parts of the body where there are tumors, and again, why quantum dots can get into tumors. Tumor normally the blood flow on inside the tumor cells are less, but these becoming, the diameter of the blood vessels are thinner, but quantum dots are still small enough to make it in over there, and also we can target it by other means, which is what we will study later, known as drug delivery. So, when you make there is a name, there are some semiconductor compound what we call as nanocrystalline. Nanocrystalline are not actually compound dots, they are semiconductor compounds. We found quantum dot, to qualify it to be a quantum dot, it has to be 2 nanometer. So, if it is between 2 and 10 nanometers, then it behaves somewhat like quantum dots, but not exactly. That is what is known as nanocrystalline. One of the use of nanocrystalline is, I can give you the reason is of nanocrystalline material is silicon. If you can make silicon into a nanocrystalline form, you can use it, that is the form which is used it as a solar cell. Normal silicon does not work in as a solar cell. If you make it, then it becomes in the optical range. So, that was nanocrystalline. So, nanocrystalline means basically there are a number of crystals, there are actually more than one quantum dot. So, there were 2 or 3, you can say 2 to 10 means maximum you can have 5 quantum dots. So, each of these quantum dots have these energy levels. So, still if it is up to the 10 nanometer, they are not overlapping with each other, they are not continuous change. So, you are seeing the effect of quantum dots. So, the absorption and emission are specific wavelengths, we are again related to the size. This is what we talked about before, it is more of a cartoon which describes that. So, we have talked about the quantum confinement, and we know, so what are the factors which determine the quantum confinement? It is the size, it has to be smaller than 2 nanometers, and the smaller the size, more is the quantum confinement, which means the larger is the energy gap, which in other words means that the wavelength would be more shifted, there would be more change in your wavelength. So, this is example of making cadmium selenide quantum dot. This is the process which says how you can make the cadmium. It is basically suspension. Yesterday I was talking with one of you, actually Gurpreet, and he said that these are certain compounds which we buy, this tri whatever. If you do lot of these compounds can be extracted out also from plants or animals or other things. So, that is one of the ways we could use it for making quantum dots from a biological method. Anyway, I am not a chemist, so I do not know from where you get this particular compound. So, this one is added, then this is basically what we call and then it is added in separate oleic acid. Then once it reaches the 225 degrees, we add, and you see different colors. The different colors means you are having different size of the quantum dots, but they are all in. You need to keep it in the suspension, and here you have to keep it in suspension in this a combination of oleic acid and octadecane. Okay. So, as you can see, cadmium selenide is a quantum dot, it is fine, but it has selective biological use is because to keep it in a quantum dot form, you have to keep it suspended in a compound with these oleic acid and octadiene, which are not very friendly for biological uses. But for other method, this is fine. We can get things of light. Also, this is the liquid way of synthesizing quantum dots. The other way of quantum dot synthesizing is by growing layers on films. You etch patterns on films, and as you grow it, the quantum dots, that is way you can make quantum dots. This way you can make quantum dot only in liquid, but if you want to make quantum dots on a substrate, so then you have to use this epitaxial growth, where you have to make it into a film. So, what we have is you have some catalyst particles kind of deposited, and then you pass in a gas, and there is a reaction goes on, and the quantum dots kind of get formed over wherever you have the catalyst particles. There is a certain way you have to do, you have to pass the precursor, and then also you have to pass something, so that the reaction does not keep on developing, because if the reaction keeps on growing, you would have the whole film covered with the material, but here you do not want, you just want it on specific regions. So, here there are pictures which shows quantum dots, where we have initially see you have deposited your catalyst materials in over here, and then you pass your gas, and then you have to control. This is, it needs lot of trial and error method at a certain how long do you pass the gas, as what temperature, because as if you keep the reaction going in forever, then these things kind of combine together. If you have it for too small, then there may be the reaction may not be complete, and you will not be able to. So, that is a part in material science where people with thin film developing techniques, they find the exact temperature, exact time to find, and these are the getting an array of quantum dot. This is an atomic force microscope image of the same thing. Next thing which is of important is we found out that cadmium selenide, the one which is before, it is not, it is, we can say it is toxic, because those chemicals what we are, I am not an expert with those chemicals, but those are not very friendly ones. So, if you still want to use the cadmium selenide because it has other properties, one way to do that is you need to coat it with a polymer. This is the standard technique which is used for all biological uses of nanoparticles. So, when you put nanomaterials inside a biological medium, you always coat it with a polymer. That polymer is either PGA, or that means there are certain polymers which are approved which have no, which is similar, you can coat it with any of those polymers. There are two advantages of that. First is you are not encountering you are not actually the biological cells are not coming in direct contact with the cadmium selenide, you have coated it. The other advantage is on this polymer surface you can do functionalization. That means you can make the polymer surface that for a certain, when certain reaction happens, certain antigen, or you can coat some antigen or antibody on top of it. So, when reaction comes in, then these antigens get combined onto the surface of that, and so what happens is you have a larger size and you can see the change in color. The other thing that here for quantum dot it can be shown is actually if you have a core or shell, this is something which is very important, is if it has a core or shell, the quantum dots have better optical properties than one which is quantum dots which is just intrinsic quantum dots or which is not coated. So, not only the coating helps in preventing it, but also it increases improves the quality of the signal that comes out from that. Now, the question you can you answer why this happens? Why by coating it with a polymer you increase the intensity of the signal. The wavelength and all is dependent on the size, you cannot change the wavelength, but what you can say is change is the intensity, the brightness. Okay, wavelength gives the color, the brightness is given by how much the intensity or how many of them gets. So, each electron jumping gives you one color, but if you have like 100 electrons jumping, then you would be having all those will give that color. So, it will be an intense bright color. So, by putting this,
maybe they prevent recombination in the solid, in the fluid pattern.
yes, that could be one of the reasons. Is if you have a cadmium selenide just by itself, you have a cadmium selenide next to it, they might combine and the size may be more than 10 nanometers. So, then that becomes ineffective. So, your quantum dot will only work only when you have an isolated that. If you put it in suspension, you can guarantee that some of them would be in suspension, but you cannot guarantee all 100% of them would be in suspension. That could be one of the reasons. Another reason is when you, and so if you coat it, they are not being able to combine with each other. The other thing is when there is, by coating it, you are preventing the loss. That means when you have number of atoms, the jumping of electrons take place, but if you do not cover it, it is like if you are trying to look at your not watch, when you are looking at your phone out in the sunlight, you need to cover it up so that it does not. So, it is basically preventing leakage of electrons jumping from the other side. So, by putting a coat on top of it, you are preventing that from happening. So, you are covering it. That is the reason whenever you do an optics experiment, or if you have done it in your high school or any time, you do it in a dark room. So, this is basically the effect of what it is doing it in a dark room. So, you are getting more intensity of the, but you can't overdo it. This coating cannot be, this is 2 nanometers. If you put a coating, you cannot put a 5 nanometers coating on top of it, then you would be losing the properties of the quantum dots. The epitaxial growth, we will talk more about that when we go in the when we talk about one dimensional growth. These are different methods which are used for growing, laser ablation, vapor phase, liquid phase epitaxy, molecular beam epitaxy. It is basically after you put the catalyst in over there. In laser ablation, you use a laser to heat up exactly those places where the catalysts are, and then you pass the gas. So, that is why the reaction happens only at that places. that is laser ablation. In vapor phase there is some type of chemistry which happens when you pass the vapor on top of it. It is only at that places where you have put in the catalyst particle, that places the reaction happens and does not happen anywhere else. In either you do it in vapor phase or sometimes you pass liquid over top of it, so that you do in liquid phase, or in molecular beam epitaxy you use a beam of, instead of a laser you use a molecular beam to kind of go exactly at that place and make the reaction go. Out of these, this is the most precise method, molecular beam epitaxy. It is a very expensive instrument. If you happen to have one, you would be able to grow. Again, out of these, all these techniques, if you do not have resources to do all these, this would be the easiest way of growing, just making something in vapor phase. It doesn't spend a lot of effort in doing this. So let us now talk about the applications. So we talk about the biological applications. So the main applications for quantum dots is tagging and labeling. So we would tag or label that with. So you can do in vivo or in vitro imaging. You can do pathogen toxin detection. You can label cells. Let us show you some. So what is biological tagging? You have organic molecules which have some genetically coded. So if there are certain proteins which react, then how do we know that it has, there are some, it is a standard technique in biology, there are some chemically synthesized fluorescent dyes which kind of change color when that particular reaction occurs. We would talk about that in our next class. We would have different types of blotting techniques in biology or different types of other techniques. All of these work, we finally look at the change in color, and how do you know the color is changing is once the reaction happens, then that gives rise to, there has been a lot of research in finding out, it is known as actually fluorescent dye chemistry. There are a lot of dyes which come in and you can observe. But the downside of that thing is you need to observe the change in color. You have to have a certain amount of the reaction to take place before there is enough that you can observe the change in color. If you do not want, and also that might take time. For example, if you are trying to look at bacterial cells, you need to culture a certain amount of bacteria before that particular protein or particular thing is produced before it. So that is why some tests might take 2 days, some tests might take 3 days, because the way to make the bacteria grow is not, it does not, it has its own time. By using quantum dots, so what you can do is you can get the same effect by even when the reaction has just started. When you have 1 or 2 protein things have reacted, you would be able to see the detection. So you do not have to wait for a million of them to combine to give enough. That is one. The other thing is in biological you do not have a continuous fluorescence for extended periods. When you put the thing, you see it fluoresce, you take pictures, but you can't monitor a whole process going on. If you want to see how the protein reacts and then what happens after that, if you want to monitor, quantum dots would be able to do that, because you would be having that bright, whatever the color comes out, you would be having it for a longer period of time. And again, these dyes only operate for, it changes color from say red to green, but for quantum dots, if you add different types of quantum dots, one changes from red to blue when certain changes, the other one changes. So what you can do, you can monitor several processes at the same time. So that is what we call as multicolor. Or maybe for the first step you would have this change, if the next step happens you would be having that change. So the bottom line is you would be able to micromanage whatever is happening in the cell by using quantum dots. So the quantum dots are excellent fluorophores. So what is fluorescence? what is the difference between fluorescence and luminescence? What is fluorescence?
It's a phenomenon in which when you incident the light on some sort of gas, supposing, the particles that are present, they absorb the light and then they radiate the light that has a frequency that is different from the incident light.
So a compound will absorb the light of particular wavelength.
Yes. So, if you have those energy levels, absorbed light means when light comes in, then it would absorb and it would go up to the higher level. That's right. And then you have to wait for a certain time, and then it would jump back. Once it jumps back, then it would emit that light. What is luminescence?
So it will directly emit the light as it will absorb the light.
It will reflect the incident light.
So, yes, luminescence and fluorescence. Fluorescence would be the light that would come out from the material would be of a different wavelength than the light that it has absorbed. Okay. It depends on the property. Luminescence, it would be basically reflecting the same. If you jam the electron goes up and then it comes back down, it would emit the same frequency of light. Again, luminescence, you could trigger luminescence by doing other things, by putting electric field, and it is known as electroluminescence. You could have luminescence done by putting phospholuminescence. So, you could put it by certain chemicals which would do it phospholumescence. So, anyway, so in fluorescence, this is a type of luminescence. So, the photon that triggers, so all quantum dots are compounds which are fluorescents are known as fluorophores. So, quantum dots. So, they absorb light over a wide frequency, store it, and then it emits of a particular frequency. So, you would be able to see. So, what is the advantage of that? We can use a single excitation source to excite quantum dots of different colors. So, if you have multiple quantum dots, you do not need different sources for each one of them, because they absorb a multiple frequency of color. You can use the source as one source, every one of them would absorb the same, but depending on their size, how much the size has changed, they would emit different frequencies. So, you would be able to see a multicolored display where different things have. So, this is the absorption and emission spectra of cadmium selenide and zinc sulfide quantum dots, and we are comparing it to a standard. This is rhodamine, is a common organic dye. So, this is the quantum dot. What you observe over here is, you see it is lot more sharper. The frequency when it goes up and down, it goes from the width is 30 nanometer, while this is one of the the same place the width is 50 nanometers. So, what does the width signify? That means the change happens over a shorter range. So, that is why you would be able to detect. So, this is quantum dots have been used for detecting cancer cells. So, you see this is a rat, and the quantum dots have been injected, and then depending upon when we put it under a light source, they luminous at different colors, blue, green, yellow, and each of these colors are related to a certain chemical reaction occurring, and from there you can get the idea. So, maybe if you look at a tumor, you would be able to know which of this tumor are at an advanced stage, which part of the tumor is still at the growing stage or at the development stage. All you can do it all in and just one test. So, as we say in biology, quantum dots are an attractive alternative to traditional organic dyes because of their high quantum yield and stability. So, what is known as a quantum yield? quantum yield is defined as number of photons that is emitted to the number of photons it absorbs. A better quantum yield means it emits almost most of the photons that it absorbs. If most of them, this is the thing which I said is coating the quantum dot with a layer, you increase the quantum yield, because you lose less photons that are coming out. So, a higher quantum yields, brighter emission, and the photo stability is due to the excitation source. So, these are different types. This picture shows different types of quantum dots: cadmium selenide, cadmium no, this is cadmium sulfide, this is cadmium selenide, cadmium telluride, cadmium mercury telluride, and these are all they show at different wavelengths. As you see, most of them are in the visible range. This one is little bit on the 400, but this is the wavelength. So, some of them are going more into things going into the 1000, and this size is the diameter of the quantum dot. So, as the diameter changes from 3 nanometers to 5 nanometers, again most of these quantum dots over there, the theoretical limit was 2 nanometers, but as you see, most of these quantum dots are about like around 2 or 3 nanometers. Some of these are actually started in later, but they are all less than 10 nanometers the limit. So, and this is how much, as the diameter changes, this is how much the shift in the frequency. The one you should choose are the ones which have a wider shift, because then you would be able to detect it a larger change in frequency. If it has an almost vertical line, that means it started off with around 400, close to 500, and then when it went up, it went to again 550. So, this one, even though the size changed from 2 nanometer to 8 nanometer, the frequency shift is not that much. Again, you can calculate these. Why? That these all depends upon what are the band gaps of these materials. Once you know the band gaps, you would be able to calculate this. This is what we said is the bioconjugated quantum dots. Is the quantum dots is when you attach it to a ligand, and with the this is, you are coating it with PEG. This is the polymer you are coating it with, and then you can make it selectively kind of with the ligand, you can selectively connect it to a particular compound, and based on that it would change its size and it would change the color. So, where are bioconjugated quantum dots used? We would talk about this. There are this common in biology. There are certain selective. There are this is the avidin biotin complex. These are when you have one, it selects the other one. You need, whenever you want to detect something, you want to have a selective reaction taking place, and nothing else should be taking place which should overpower this. So, that is these in biology, these are the three common coordinating. So, the avidin biotin complex, they are particularly, they react only with themselves, the protein A, protein G, and then there are some other polymers, or so you can detect if that certain enzymes there or not. Now, so again this is not a real image, but it is a simulated image. It shows how the quantum dots conjugated with the amplified with the molecules, it changes color, it changes from purple to green as when you put the linker. Again, this is not a real experiment, this is a simulation result. The other places where quantum dots are being used is, I think this experiment was mentioned by Professor Chakravarti on the first day, when he used a biomems for detecting, this is for detecting DNA hybridization. He said that at the end of the thing there were some fluorophores, some color which showed. Those are basically the quantum dots. So, the quantum dots are targeted, are attached to this particular DNA. So, when the DNA the target DNA, when it hybridizes, these quantum dots kind of change their size, and based on their they kind of show the color. So, if you look at the chip, it shows different color distribution. You can make it even smaller, because if you put an image processing algorithm on these, you would be able to know exactly how much the color changes, and your normal smartphone also has those image is enough to get the image processing algorithm. The other application of quantum dots is as light emitters. So, quantum dots are basically one of the reasons why right now we have changed from regular light to LEDs. You know, why in LED we consume lot less power than the regular. If you had a 50 watt or 60 watt light, how much thing you are emitting is you now get more powerful light, but spending less energy, because you are making things more efficient. So, inside the LED you actually have those quantum dots which generate those energy, and that is why right now if you look at any car, the tail lights of the car, you do not have a red bulb, you have a lot of the LEDs. So, that is why the traffic signals are made with LEDs, so it can produce a light from a longer distance. Additional applications, quantum dots, this is the place where it is used, but more as a solar cells. We would be, there are more applications that are being developed for quantum dots. So, right now the biological application is its principal application. It is basically for detecting certain things happening. It is used as an LED and also being used for as a solar cell. Okay, so, this is about the how it works for solar cell. Anyway, we were not going more into this. It's time, I think we can jump to the next slide. These are the ones which talk more about the solar cell applications, but again I do not think we should talk about that. Okay, any questions? So, can we take a break a little early, not at 11:30, and then we will come back and we do the nano wire bit. Okay, any questions before we take the break? Okay. So, if there are no questions, then we can take the break and then we will come back, I think in 10 minutes.
Quenchers for like quantum dots are attached to a substrate.
Yes.
Some people use quenchers to hide that intensity of light. Like if it will be attached with a quencher,
Yes.
then it will not emit the light. But after when it will be separated, then it can emit the light. Something like that.
That's right. Yes, yes. Because you want to see the yeah, you don't want to see the light light always. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Because sometimes if one quantum dot is emitting
What
light.
is that quencher form like? Is it like similar to quantum dots, and then when they are attached, it will increase the size and it will not emit the light, something like that, or
Quencher is certain like a curtain, you know. It is basically a material which has a very high refractive index. So, when the light kind of or not refractive index, it is a material which has very low transmission coefficient, it has more absorption.
how it makes that quantum dot not emitting the light.
Now, quantum dot emits the light,
Yeah,
but
But
that
how it
medium, the
hides it?
quencher absorbs it.
quencher is very much similar to that one. So how it hides it, like how it coats it, like
No, the quencher, the material it is such that it absorbs that light. So, whenever the light gets in part, we would now talk around our one dimensional nanomaterials. This is there are we will talk about carbon nanotube, where most of my research has been over there. Carbon nanotube, Then we would talk about two of the elemental semiconductor nanowires, silicon and germanium, primarily silicon, little bit of germanium. Then we would talk about there are semiconductors nanowire, not all of the 3-5 group elements form quantum dots, they also there are ones which form nanowires, you can make nanowires out of it. And then we would talk about another material, a ceramic material which forms a nanotube, and then finally the zinc oxide. These are all different types of one dimensional material. By the by, while I was talking, I was informed, I told that carbon does not form any quantum dot, but I was informed by, can you tell me your name please? I was informed by Tamal that they are in their lab they have been able to make carbon quantum dots. Okay. So, they have actually split a graphene sheet into small sections, and each section they have been able to make quantum dots, and also he was talking of something making from orange juice you have taken. So, anyway, whatever is the nanotechnology is a field which is keeping on changing. So, whatever you say today, next couple of years later there it may not be true anymore, you might be able to things might be changing. Okay. So, you have to keep, it is very difficult to keep up to speed with every area what is happening. You can keep up with the speed in your section, whatever research or whatever subtopic you are working on. So, again I would like if I say something over here and in your lab or you know of some research which is contradicting to whatever I have said, then please let me know, and I will then announce it to the rest of the class, so that you know that whatever I said was true earlier, but may not be true right now, because there have been reports or something what you have done. That is the whole purpose of having a summer school like that, is you tend to learn about different other groups work also. So, again I think we are familiar with these two types of how do you fabricate nanomaterials, that means how do you make nanomaterials. There are two techniques, top down and bottom up. Normally top down methods is when you take the material and gradually scrape off layers and layers and layers, ultimately when you come up to the nano form of that material. Bottom up is more common, where you do self assembly, you take molecules and kind of attach them to make it into a particular structure. The quantum dot fabrication I told you by doing the liquid method, where you use it and put it in the oleic acid solution. What type of fabrication was that, top down or bottom up? You remember in the last slide I said there were, when we were making the cadmium selenide quantum dot in the liquid form, you added something, I forget the name of the DM the compound, and then finally you used oleic acid and made it in the. So, if you try to classify that, under which category would it fall? Would it fall like a top down synthesis or a bottom up? It is bottom up, okay, because we are trying to get things react. Anything that involves chemistry would be bottom up method. Anything top down method would be laser ablation, means when you use something to ablate, like layers of. Can you tell me which a material which can be made in the top down method? Mostly metallic nanowires. If you want a iron nanowire, or if you want to have a copper nanowire, those are made with top down methods. The reason is to have chemical methods to go on the bottom up method. For iron or things, they have very high melting points. So, you would not be able to set up your system to, because in all the other made, either you start with vapor or liquid form of the material what you are starting to start the reaction. For metals, that melting point is extremely high. So, that is why they was used by the top down technique. Again ion milling, focused ion beam, I think some of you have seen the focused ion beam or the other techniques. Those are techniques which are all the top down methods. Okay. Currently the semiconductor technology uses top down. So, I told you all the top down, the positives and negatives of the top down, and top down, these are the methods. What are the materials which are made by the top down? Normally materials which have extremely high melting point. Nano ceramics, do you know nano ceramics? These are ceramic materials which are made in the nano form. All of you have used, I think, solid state lasers, or not all of you, some of you have used solid state lasers. The solid state laser crystals, lot of them are made with nano ceramic crystals. So, those are the ones. So, the top down process is a slow process, you cannot make large scale nanomaterials. If you are planning to sell nanomaterials, you would never be able to do with the top down. You can maybe do, it is a slow process, but in the bottom up, you can, if you can control the process very much, then you would be able to make. So, most of the materials we would be talking about are made by this technique. So, in the nanotube and nanowire synthesis, there are different methods. What this is an old slide, but these was the methods of how you can make the nanotube or nanowire. One was the laser ablation, the other was the chemical vapor deposition. This has different parts of the chemical vapor deposition depending upon how you are getting the chemical vapor. You can have it plasma enhanced, you can have microwave, you can have hydrocarbon, then there was arc discharge. This is the technique which was the first one that was used for making carbon nanotube. So, what is laser ablation? So, how do you make nanomaterials? I think the next slide actually talks about that, isn't it? Okay. So, how do you make nanomaterials? What is the process going on? The next slide actually tells you what do you want when you want to make the synthesis. You need to have something which has kind of identical size distribution of particles. When you make 10 nanometer particles, approximately most of the particles should be 10 nanometer. Again, it is difficult to do that, the size kind of follows a Gaussian graph, but the majority of them should have that distribution. It should have, preferably you should try to have it identical shape. That means, if they are quantum dots, they are all spherical in shape. If they are nanotubes, they are all the kind of the same in shape. Identical chemical composition, uniform physical and chemical properties, and no agglomeration into larger chunks, that means coming in together. Preferably crystalline, and these last two easy to synthesize, and finally cheap. It is very difficult to have a synthesis technique which satisfies all these criteria. So, but which one of them are most important? The first four, these or 5 actually, and with no agglomeration. Crystallinity is important, but not always. For example, what is crystallinity is important, especially when you are making it the material on a substrate. They are crystalline, but for if you are using it for other purposes, as you are using it in suspension or other places, crystallinity may or may not be important. Actually, for some places you might not. Okay, going back to here, how do you make? What is the process of making a nanomaterial? How? In the bottom up method. In the bottom up method, what you have to do is you are assembling molecule by molecule and making, and then you are going up to a certain stage and stopping the reaction. You do not want it to grow anymore, because if you keep it growing, it would grow into a bigger size. So, normally what you do is you start with either the vapor form of the material that you are trying to grow, and you pass the vapor over. You have a kind of a catalyst. What the catalyst does is, it first of all it reduces the temperature at which the whole process takes place, and the catalyst, especially if you are trying to make carbon nanotube, A catalyst plays a critical role, because in carbon nanotube what you want is a structure where there should be a hole. So, the catalyst actually is a particle which stays there over here, and it prevents the carbon nanotube from crushing down and making. If it crushes down in this form, it does not make a tube. If you are familiar, then it forms what we call amorphous carbon, it does not make. So, the catalyst particles are there, and then at the end, after that you need the thing to cool down, and the cooling down process is the most critical in making the nanomaterials, because it should cool down in such a way that it forms, it tends to keep the nanomaterial over there. Otherwise, if you cool down very rapidly, then the nanomaterials might tend to change, it may not be able to keep their same composition, especially if you are making compound ones like 2 or 3 different, like boron nitride or other things which have 2 more elements together. So, now these all techniques what I told you over here, they all follow the same criteria. In the laser ablation, the difference is we do not start with the gaseous form, we start with the solid form of the material. So, we make the vapor right over there. So, we use a laser, we take carbon and we make it into a hard material, we put the laser on top of it, melt it and make it into vapor carbon, and then the next part is the same. In the chemical vapor deposition, we already have the vapor. So, we pass the vapor and we get it over here. In laser ablation we use, but what is the advantage of having laser ablation? You have greater control. When you heat with a laser, you are hitting one spot. So, at one spot you can heat the temperature very high, and so you go from a high, because I said the critical way of making nanoparticles is you have to go from high temperature to a low temperature, and how you have the temperature gradient, that decides on how the nanoparticle you are, especially one dimensional nanomaterials, for the way you are making. The arc discharge, so these CVD are these the different forms over here are the different sources. So, if the chemical, sometimes what you have to do is when the CVD comes in, you have to increase the temperature of that. So, use a plasma to increase that, or you put it into a microwave furnace to increase it, or you can use this one is the starting material is hydrocarbon. So, you start with, again all these we are talking primarily in reference of making nanotube. For silicon silicon or germanium nanowires, this one works, this one works, the arc discharge does not work. Again these ones would also some of them work. The hydrocarbon is something which is the source of carbon. If you are starting with silicon, it has to be what you call a compound which has silicon connected to it. So, the chemical of choice for silicon is actually a hydrogen and silicon compound. It is known as silane, which is silicon hydride, SiH4. If you know, it is very you have to be very cautious to deal with it. The SiH4 is a very toxic material. So, silicon has that. Germanium, you cannot form a hydride. So, this means you need to have a hydrocarbon which is already in the gaseous form, which we can use it, or you can start with the high pressure with carbon monoxide to do it. The arc discharge, this is the technique. In all these techniques you can make maybe some milligrams of carbon nanotube after running the process for a few hours. So, if you want to make large scale make of carbon nanotube, you have to use what is known as arc discharge. In arc discharge, it is like welding. You have 2 electrodes, one is carbon, the other is also carbon. The one carbon has the catalyst, and you pass, like welding, you pass a very high current in between the 2 electrodes. If you try to put in very high voltage and try to pass a current between that, initially nothing is going to happen. Then what would happen is there would be an arc, there would be a spark that would go over there. That spark goes to wherever the catalyst is, it melts that catalyst, and you have exactly the same process of making the carbon nanotubes. So, once the arc discharge is done, you take out the 2 electrodes. In one electrode you would have the buckyballs, or the form of carbon, which is a circular form, in the other electrode you would be having the carbon nanotubes form, and the process is very fast. You can pass the current in maybe like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and depending on the size of the electrode you would have the electrode covered with carbon nanotubes. But the negative of the arc discharge technique is you do not have a lot of control on how nanotubes are going, how long they would be, what would be their size, because it depends on how you are getting the arc. You do not know which part would be. Sometimes you can make the arc favorable by making some geometrical structures on the electrode, so then you know that the arc would kind of hit, the arc or spark. When a lightning strikes, it strikes the tallest building. So similarly, the same way when the spark strikes, if you make this thing rough, then it would strike the higher peak, so that you can make but still less control. Then there are these other techniques which people are being using. Biological methods are also, you can use electrolysis by putting 2 electrodes, passing current, having then depending on the passing the current and how you put, again you need to put catalyst on one of the electrodes and you use making it. Ultrasound is, instead of using laser or the gas, you are basically using ultrasound to melt. So basically you need something to melt the thing into vapor form and make the. So for the bottom up synthesis, it is basically thermodynamics and its reaction kinetics which control the process. To start the process, first what you have to do is what we call a supersaturation. Anybody knows what is a supersaturation solution?
So when you heat a saturated solution and then add more solute, then there comes a time when solute is stopped to dissolve.
That's right, that is what is super saturated. Saturated is whenever you cannot add any more solute to a solvent at a particular temperature. Now if you heat up, you can keep adding more till a place you reach a point after which it starts to, you can't heat the temperature more, it would start to evaporate. So that is a super saturated. So what you want is wherever you start to make your nano, it should be heated up so much with the catalyst that it should form a super saturated solution. And then from the supersaturated solution, the catalyst starts it to growth, so you would be having a nucleation. So nucleation is where the first nanoparticle starts growing. So in the supersaturated solution you have to create some point where it starts to grow. I told you for the quantum dots, when we use epitaxy we use certain spots. So those are the spots where you can start your nucleation to go, and then it will have subsequent growth, and then the later part is once it starts growing, then you need to prevent agglomeration. How do you prevent agglomeration? Most of the time it is by the timing of the process, how long you make the process going, or sometimes you put some what is known as poisoning agent. You put something over there which stops the reaction. So that is what, otherwise it would start going from nano to bigger size. And in thermodynamics it is what is known as the reduction of the Gibbs free energy to go in. There are different synthesis processes, vapor, solid, vapor. So this is, you start with vapor and then end up with solid. This is, it goes from a vapor to a liquid stage and then goes into solid. You have start with a solution, end with a solid, going through the liquid stage. Why do you need it into a liquid stage always? Here you do not need a liquid stage, but the liquid stage is where you can craft how your nanomaterial would be formed. So the liquid kind of, liquid you can mold it, you can make it into whatever size the container you would like to. So that kind you can there is also another type of where what you known as template feeling. So if you try to have already a template, you already have a carbon nanotube, you can make nanomaterials or something already in there. So that is what we call it, the template. This basically shows the process how it is going. So the growth material comes in, this is the solid surface where you have the catalyst, this is where the nanowire starts, and then it kind of goes away from here. We talk about the vapor solid synthesis. Here what you need is, you need a first very good adsorption. So how you want on the substrate, on this substrate, how you would like your material to be adsorbed. Adsorbed means it gets only on the surface of the material. So, to promote adsorption, you can put in a catalyst, you can play with the temperature and pressure, and again you need a nucleation. For nucleation side, sometimes if you have intentionally made some defects on this crystal, those may be the nucleation sites from where the things would start to grow, and those defects are known as dislocation or twining. The zinc oxide is semiconducting wires are synthesized this way. The vapor liquid solid is also the kind of the same thing, only it has a liquid stage where the catalyst comes in. Do you know what is known as a eutectic point? Yes, it is if you look at a phase diagram, if you look at it, it is a place where you have all three, the solid, liquid and the gas at that temperature. If you move along one path, you would get more of the vapor form. If you move along one path, you would be having, so that is the solid, liquid. So, that is the critical point. So, you heat it up to that eutectic point, the supersaturated eutectic point, and then when it forms the size of the liquid, when it forms the size of the liquid drop decides the size of what would be the nanowire. So, with the catalysts, and you can detect the size by, if you can control. Again, we do not have any control of that order, but we try to do it statistically to get the growth going that way. In the solid liquid solid synthesis, we do not need to go to that high temperature, we start it in the solution, come to the exactly the same. So, how do you can make metallic nanowires by using that, by using organometallic compounds. Organometallic compounds are already in the liquid stage, so it has iron and it has other things, and then you could use it to make. This is just a diagram of showing the carbon nanotubes. This shows there are different forms of carbon nanotube. Carbon nanotube started from I think in 1986, it was 3 scientists, Richard Smalley and Harold Kroto. They got the Nobel Prize for discovering carbon has 2 allotropes, graphite and diamond. So, they discovered this particular structure, which has a hollow, which has a soccer ball structure, which is C60. I did not draw it over here. And then if you kind of pull it from C60, you can get C70 or C80, and then ultimately you can have a big. So, some polymer chemists call carbon nanotube also as a polymer, because it is C70, this is C80. So, this could be a C1 million or something if you get it into a long molecule. But actually when they grow, they do not grow it in this way. So, these are some of the images of carbon nanotube. You see this is one nanotube, next nanotube. This again this is a bundle of nanotube, and this is we are looking at it as the bundle is kind of looking up the holes in the front. A question to you, what is there inside the holes? Normally it is filled with air. So, if you want to put anything into these holes, it is you have to pump out the air, and we just talked about that in the previous class. Because of capillary action, that is one of the most difficult tasks to do. So, it looks like everything is available right in front of you, but it is not that easy. You can't try, look at the size of the hole. If you look at any atom, this is bigger than an atomic size. So, you should be able to put any atom in here theoretically, but the reason you cannot do that is because these things are already, it is not vacuum, it already has material stuff putting in over there. So, properties of carbon nanotube, why that makes it, it has a high degree of anisotropy in most properties. What does it mean? That means along certain directions carbon nanotubes have certain properties, the same cannot be said for directions in the opposite. Most of the properties of carbon nanotubes are along the tube direction. Okay. So, if it is along the tube, the properties, the best properties are along this direction. This direction it is what we said in the last class, it has a Young's modulus which is 100 times more than steel, it is a low density. So, as we said, carbon nanotubes are the strongest but lightest material. The electronic properties, we also talked about that. We talked about single wall nanotube and multi wall nanotubes. So, single wall nanotubes can be semiconducting and metallic at the same time, we will talk about that. Multi wall nanotubes are always metallic, because the reason the single wall nanotubes are metallic or semiconducting, it depends on how they are rolled, but when multi wall you have multiple walls, so how they are rolled, so it does not get important. So, they are all nanotubes exhibit quantum conductance, we will talk about that. Quantum conductance means you are familiar with Ohm's law, we will have a data and we will show you that, and they also exhibit what we known as field emission. Field emission means if you have a nanotube like this and if you put an electrode on top of it, you put a high voltage on this electrode, then electrons leave the nanotube and jump over onto the other. So, with a certain field you can generate the electrons out. What is the striking point of carbon nanotube is, normally to get electrons out you would have to put several thousand volts, that is why to get the electrons out you need kilovolts. For carbon nanotube, a 9 volt battery is good enough for getting the electrons out. My postdoc supervisor, he has made a device using this field emission properties by developing what we called as a handheld X-ray. So, he has developed, because you can get the electrons out so easily. So, he has an X-ray machine, or he has developed an X-ray machine which looks like a laptop computer, and so you can carry it along and you could do X-rays. So, you can do X-rays on the go, and he could do it because with carbon nanotube you do not need, as you do not need to raise the voltage up, you do not need the associated cooling or all the other. Chemical properties of carbon nanotube, as I said, the inside hole can be used for plugging in lot of other things, the hydrogen storage, charge storage. What is intercalation? That means if you can't put it inside the holes, then the nanotube are bundled, so you can put it in between the layers. So, that is what most of the time what you think as you are storing thing inside the hole, actually it goes, and this is what makes carbon nanotubes as very good sensors, as electronic properties change with exposure to certain chemicals. Carbon nanotube also can be used as actuators. That means if you apply a voltage to carbon nanotube, if you apply a voltage, what happens is it bends. So, you can make mechanical energy out of it. So, you can make micro motors or something out of these. So, these are plausible applications, you know, a lot of more. This is what we were showing. This is these two results, which shows what we are measuring is the carbon nanotube can be having both semiconducting and metallic properties. Here this is a semiconducting property where it shows a band gap, and here it becomes metallic. We will tell you why makes it metallic and semiconductor at the same time, but what is important is this you can make the carbon nanotube from metallic to semiconductor by changing the diameter of that. So, as you make the diameter bigger, it goes into the energy gap actually goes down. So, for certain diameter this becomes more semiconducting, if it goes this energy gap over bigger, so it becomes metallic. This we would talk about, this was done in 1998, it was a pioneering work which came out from Holland. We would talk about this when we talk about the CNT based transistors. So, we would skip that right now. These are the field emission properties. What I said is, when you put in for a certain voltage, you are getting the current out. This is basically the equation or relation which was used long time back when we used vacuum diodes. So, vacuum diodes work in the same principle as that with the carbon nanotubes. These are, so these This is the picture of the setup what we have. We have put, these are the individual carbon nanotubes. We put it under a system where we have high voltage, and then as it comes in, this was the first thing set up by, I think, first field emission device which was used by Samsung, which shows again the different colors what you see are not as a product of the carbon nanotube. The different color is there are different phosphorescence materials on top of it. So, carbon nanotubes are basically providing the electrons, and based on that you can show all the three different colors. What about the quantum conductance? The quantum conductance means normally when you use Ohm's law, as you change the voltage, Ohm's law says a voltage versus resistance, as you increase the voltage you get more current and the current goes linearly up. Quantum conductance means when you are increasing the voltage, the current actually does not go up, they kind of go up in certain steps, and the step height is the value which can be calculated, is given by this constant. So, these are nano circuits. These I will skip over this. This is another important property of carbon nanotube which is being used, is this is thermal property. So, the thermal conductivity of carbon nanotubes is 600 watts. If this is along the axis, this is theoretical prediction, experimentally you have been able to measure it. This is one of the most difficult experiments to do, how to pass the electric conductivity of carbon, because you have to only assure that the heat is travelling through the carbon nanotube and not anywhere else, otherwise. So, there are different ways of doing these people have tried. So, that is why it is not surprising that the result has come out less, but this is along the axis. If you measure it, the thermal conductivity perpendicular to the axis, thermal conductivity is 1000 times less. If you want to compare these numbers with that of what is the best thermal conducting material currently, we know is diamond. Okay. So, diamond has the best thermal conducting material, and diamond has a value around this number. So, or actually not this, about 1200. So, thermal conductivity of carbon nanotubes is lot higher. So, this is, we talked about some my experiment on thermal, we will just skip those right now. The other place where people have been thought of using carbon nanotube is as a part of something what is known as a fuel cell. In fuel cell you use hydrogen as the source, then you use it as a battery, and then you pass, it is basically doing just the opposite of electrolysis. In electrolysis you pass current in water, separate it as hydrogen and oxygen. In fuel cell you take hydrogen and then take oxygen, combine it together, and you are getting current. So, that is how the fuel cell works. Not only you get current, you get the byproduct which is water. So, this is fuel cell, has been used in lot of places for generating electricity, but one of the major problems of the fuel cell is how do you get hydrogen. One source is you need hydrogen. Hydrogen is, if you look at it in the atmosphere, percentage wise hydrogen is I think 0.00 something percent, 0.08%. Why? Because hydrogen is very light. So, you do not find it in the atmosphere, you find it very high up even. And again hydrogen is also a little dangerous to deal with, because if hydrogen combines with oxygen, then there is a violent reaction, it causes fire. So, that is why the storage of hydrogen right now, what is used as a fuel for storing hydrogen? It is basically alcohols are used as storage of hydrogen, but you can use it for carbon nanotubes, as I said, was one of the sources of using. Inside the carbon nanotube, if you can put in hydrogen and you can make cylinders of hydrogen of carbon nanotube stored in over there. This was proposed in the early 2000s, but people still have not been able to devise a proper way of getting the hydrogen, or the other way to get it is liquid hydrogen, which kind of these are the nanotube composites. I think somebody asked is how we can make nanotubes one after the other. Is there, and this is you make the carbon, this is you are spinning a yarn, you are making a something like a cloth with carbon nanotube. As one nanotube comes up, it winds and goes, and right over here you put some glue, the next nanotube comes in and you can spin a yarn with this. The other very important property of carbon nanotube is what we call as nano friction. Is if you take a nanotube and roll it, you would expect it to roll very smoothly like a cylinder, but it does not. It actually, the outside of the carbon nanotube is like a hexagon. So, when it rolls, what you observe is up to a certain stage, it is like if you are rolling this thing, it rolls fine, but if you try to roll some material like this, if you put a force, nothing happens, then at a certain place it topples over and turns. So, carbon nanotube actually does that. So, that is why there were models of making carbon nanotube use as what we call as a nano gear. So, if you have two carbon nanotubes next to each other, if you turn one nanotube, the other one would also be turning the way how the gears kind of get attached and turn with each other. So, that is what is known as the nano friction. There are other properties of carbon nanotube, that is the mechanical properties, it is the resilience. Nanotube is like a banana tree. If have you ever tried to cut a banana tree, that would be one of the most difficult jobs, because the banana kind of twists, bends, and that is what happens to carbon nanotube. So, if you put in a force in a shock over there, it bends, it twists, but it still does not tear. You cannot, it is almost impossible to cut a carbon nanotube across. Whatever you have, they will bend. You can burn it, but you will not be able to, and these are all experiments which shows that. So, it is its resilience. Sorry, this is a repeat. These are the systems which we made the carbon nanotubes. So, we compare with carbon nanotube and the silicon nanowire. If you look at the image, the electron microscopy image in the same scale, they look exactly identical. Right now, if I did not put the label over on top of it, you would not have been able to tell one is silicon and the other is carbon. But if you look more into the details, if you go higher resolution, this would be a hollow, this would be a tube. So, this would be like this, and this would be, this is a solid structure. See, there is nothing. So, what is the similarity? Like carbon nanotube, silicon nanowires also has similar structure, diameter, crystalline. Carbon nanotube came off from C60. Silicon, there has been silicon can exhibit a structure like silicon 46. It is a very unstable structure, but you can find out, and from there you can think that like C60, C70, C80 you made the carbon nanotube. Similarly, you can have this. So, similar synthesis mechanisms, they are semiconductors, both exhibit quantum confinement. There are some applications you can use them both, though silicon's mechanical properties are not as strong as that of carbon. Carbon's mechanical strength properties are. What are the differences? Main, solid and hollow. Carbon nanotube is stable at room temperature, but silicon has one of the main problem is it oxidizes. So, you would very rarely find pure silicon, you would have oxidized. It has single wall, multi wall, it has only one form, it could be metallic and semiconducting. Silicon nanowire is only semiconducting, and not only that, the band gap of silicon nanowire depends upon the diameter of it. So, if you change the diameter, you can make. I told earlier that silicon has a band gap of 1.1 electron volt, which is not in the visible spectrum. So, if you want to make silicon in the visible spectrum, the only way to do it is by using this. So, this has silicon
is known for its optical properties. Any semiconductor material is known for its optical properties, while carbon nanotube is known more for its mechanical properties. Thermal properties are also important. Carbon nanotube, because of its hollow thing, can do intercalation and storage. Silicon does not have that. Carbon has ways for biological applications. Carbon is lot better because what you could do is you could functionalize things, adding chemicals on top of it, and that changes properties. Nothing can be done with. You can functionalize silicon. There is silicon chemistry. You can do that, but it is not as easy as doing it with carbon. It has actuator properties. This does not. There are other silicon nanowires. We'll doing it with. The purpose of this study was we wanted to make a nanowire which is a combination of silicon and germanium. Like you have gallium arsenide or other one, silicon and germanium, if you can mix them together, depending upon the ratio of which is more, you can change the band gap to your, but these two materials are so dissimilar that you cannot make an alloy or you cannot make a compound in between. So, that is what we talked about. We will cross over this. These are what I said is when you make the nanotube, these are some of our experimental results, which basically tells the conditions which kind of make. I just tell you about our. We said that when the nanotubes grow, let us go back to this one and then I will tell you. I had a bigger picture of, yeah. So, this is the laser ablation setup what we use for making the carbon nanotubes. So, for laser ablation we had a target which is the carbon material, we have a laser focused on it. So, it makes the vapor form, the vapor goes out and then it gets cooled over here, and these black parts are where they form the carbon nanotube. Now, this target is what? Target is carbon and it has the catalyst material present in over here. We used one type of catalyst, depending upon the type of catalyst you get the diameter of the nanotubes that are formed here. In silicon you do the exactly same thing, only your target is now made out of silicon and your temperature and things are different. Now, what we did when silicon was getting formed, while this thing was getting heated up, it happened accidentally, suddenly the furnace got switched off and then we again turned it on, and to our surprise we found out that the material that came out like this. That means you have other pictures of that. If you look at it in higher resolution, you see you have the main nanowires and then on the side it grew up like a tree with branches. This structure is there with silicon. It's known earlier, it's known as, it's like the dendritic structure, so it's known as nano dendrites. What the advantage of that is it has a catalyst over here. So, if you are planning to make a circuit out of it, if you are trying to join another silicon with another, these helps because now you have a larger area. Not only that, you have the particles right over here. So, these can be, if you heat it up, these can be welded up and you could join up and you can make. I showed a picture of a nano circuit before. So, if you want to make circuits with this, these materials can work, and this was only fabricate and later we reproduced it. We had to change the temperature whether it forms. This is kind of the growth model what we have. This is the silicon, it starts the eutectic mixture, it starts growing, and suddenly by changing the temperature or doing something we create a nucleation slide and it starts growing from here as well as this, and it grows till this place is. These are the chemical vapor deposition system. Again, what we did was when we made it into nano, we found out that the temperature, melting temperature of the silicon nanowire has decreased by 100 degree by making it in the nano form. So, silicon germanium nanowires, we talked about that. We use them in form of battery. Let us just, this is again it is not used for medical things. So, I will we used made we said one of the application of nanowires is using it as a battery. You can put charges inside the nanowires. So, this is what we fabricated, a lithium ion battery with silicon nanowire, and we, the important thing what we got was the normal lithium batteries have a capacity. What does the capacity means is how much it holds up charge. That was our number was coming out almost double. So, we could keep the battery rechargeable, the charge in the battery double the time, that was longer. In fact, this thing this battery has been patented, and if you have a Vaio laptop, Sony uses this battery in the Vaio laptop. So, in one of their models. So, that will pass over here. What happened to the sorry, I looked at okay. We'll talk about okay, the zinc oxide. I don't know, it got I had something with the boron nitride and zinc oxide, those things are okay. So, what is the time right now? It is 12:30. So, we can try to do our next okay. Can I did I go over this too quickly? I went over there too quickly because they were not related to the medical applications. If you want, I can talk more about whatever we did over there. Any questions?
Yes, sir. You were saying that you will be explaining the DNA probe hybridization.
Oh, the hybridization, yeah, that is tomorrow. Okay, tomorrow we'll talk about the hybridization. Actually, when we talk about sensors, I will talk more about my work on sensors.
So can you explain that molecular beam epitaxy?
Molecular beam. This I don't have slides for it right now. I can explain it to you later after the class if you want. I have to draw diagrams and I can explain it to you. Anything else about this, and then we can move to the carbon nanotube transistors. What we did over here in nutshell, we found out the different properties of carbon nanotube. How do we make carbon nanotube? And we looked at the thermal properties as well as we looked at where is the thermal properties of carbon nanotube useful. The thermal properties of carbon nanotubes, they have right now they are being used as cancer therapy, that is right, inside, but there the thermal conductivity, what you do is you put the nanotubes inside cancer cells and you put electromagnetic waves. So, the carbon nanotubes heat up and they kill, but that is still, that thing is under because after the carbon nanotube is evaporates, there are traces of the catalyst particles which were used to make the carbon nanotube that still resides in the body. So, those are the catalysts that are used for making the nanotubes are chromium, iron is there, chromium is there, these are rare earth which eventually you do not know what will happen to them. So, that is a problem unless we can get there are techniques which people have developed, like all these techniques what I have taught, they all need a catalyst, because otherwise the nanotube kind of squeezes down. I thought I had the graphene transparency here, but I do not know, I am not seeing the graphene one, because I thought with carbon nanotube we will go the graphene. Okay, next one. Do you have graphene in your, when I converted it into the PDF to the PowerPoint, I think I made a mistake, I did not convert the correct one. In your lecture notes, do you have graphene parts?
In the next page.
Oh, okay, so that could be, because I thought we would do, okay, let's. So let's, oh, this is the power PDF version, is it? Okay. So, one of the application I put in my last slide, we talked about in 1998, it was Decker's group which used carbon nanotube and worked it as a field effect transistor. Yes. Oh, this one had this part, is it? Okay, let me kind of little confused. Okay. Okay. Let's come back to this. I think one thing which we skipped last in my last one when we were talking about the carbon nanotube, we said carbon nanotubes can be both semiconducting and metallic. This is the way how depending upon the carbon nanotube, the carbon nanotube is formed. Another way of imagining carbon nanotube is you take a graphene sheet and roll it up. So, when you roll it up, if you can see the atoms going, you see this one is going zigzag zigzag. So, this is the type of carbon nanotube which has the metallic properties. Then if you have something which it is like taking a sheet of paper, so this is the graphene sheet. So, if you can roll the graphene sheet this way, this has become your carbon nanotube. So, this nanotube is different from if you roll it up this way. Electrical properties, if you roll it up along the diagonal. So, if you roll it up like this. So, this nanotube and the previous one has different electronic properties. Why? Because all these are hexagons and there are carbon atoms. So, what you can think of as each of these has pi electrons. So, right over here this way, this way, this way are the pi electrons which are sticking out. Now, when you roll them up, so here the pi electrons are sticking them out. So, the way they are would be conducting would be different if I roll them up in a different way, then we would be having pi electron here, 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 here. So, the way they would be conducting would be, so this would be here they are lined up, so they would be more like a metallic type, and this way there would be a semiconductor type. Also there is you can these N and M, if you look at it, these are when you write in a lattice form, these are how many units you move along this direction, and it's now how many units you move. So, depending on that you would be you can predict where your carbon nanotube would be metallic or semiconducting. This is another very important result, is one way to do changing carbon nanotube from metallic to semiconducting is how you make it. But suppose you already have a carbon nanotube which is already a certain type, it is already a metal. Now, this experiment shows that by applying force on it, that means already you have your carbon nanotube rolled away in it, if you can deform it by applying, so by deforming it you can change carbon nanotube from a metal to a semiconductor. So, when you are pulling on carbon nanotube, what you are doing is those pi electrons which are over there, by pulling on them you are stretching them, and so you are changing the electronic properties, and that is why you are making from metal to a semiconductor. So, this can be used as measuring microscopic movement or stress or strain by, because the carbon nanotube properties, by when they are applying force on it, you can use it. People are trying to use this technique to measure stress in cells. If you have a cell which gets stressed, its outer walls become the mechanical properties changes, but there are no direct ways of measuring how much the mechanical properties has changed. So, there are groups which are working and they are trying to find out, like when the cell is put under a stress, how much the cell wall the property changes. And so, if we can measure that, because it is known that lot of the diseases which we carry, starting from diabetes to blood pressure, are all related to stress. So, if we can measure, then we would be able to diagnose. It may not be related to diet, it may not be related to other things, but it might be related to stress. Stress is actually the worst enemy of us. So, these are more results on if you can twist, you can bend carbon nanotubes. If you can do that, then there are the energy of it changes, and you can find this was and measure their electronic properties. This is another important result, is you have a bucky paper, not a sorry, a bucky ball put inside a carbon nanotube. So, this is encapsulated with C60 or fullerenes, and now if you try to measure the electronic properties, you have the electronic properties, the electronic properties depend on where you have these things positioned, wherever the fullerenes are. So, you can move the fullerenes and your electronic properties change. So, you can have these fullerenes, these are there are nobody has been able to do it, but there are ideas where you would be having some reactions going on inside over here in the fullerenes in this space, and you can be able to monitor as it moves through. So let us start talking about transistors. Do you know what a transistor is? Where it is used? it is integrated circuits have millions of transistors in it, billions of transistors in it, but what is a transistor? In short, transistor is a device which has 3, it is an electrical device which has 3 terminals. You put signal inside over here, you get a current coming out on the other side, and the third one is used as a regulator. So, suppose you put a voltage on here, if you want to, by changing the terminal on the other side, you can vary whatever is coming on the third terminal. You can amplify it, most of the time you would be able to amplify it, and how you can amplify it is by putting in an extra volt, because you need energy, you can't just take something and amplify it without applying it. So, there are 2 types of transistors, one is not 2, there are a lot of different types of transistors, but the one which we are trying over here is known as the FET, field emission transistor. So, the 3 terminals over here are these, one is the source, the other is the drain, and the third one is the gate. So, gate is the controlling terminal. So, depending upon what happens is the electrons go from source to the drain. Now, when you apply more, depending upon if the electrons are going in this direction, then if you apply a more negative voltage to the gate, what happens? The electrons and electrons repel. So, what would happen? It would be like squeezing this, the effect would be such that this channel would be squeezed. So, there would be less current going from the source to the drain. Now, if you put a positive voltage onto the gate, this would pull and it would make the channel bigger. So, your entire thing is to make your channel bigger and smaller. Normally, the whole thing is made up in a silicon device, but right now with carbon nanotube, what we try to do is we put our nanotube in between the source and the drain, and then we use the gate. The advantage of that is, now if you can have any, say you are trying to use it, we will talk about that, you are trying to use it as a sensor. As a sensor means when certain gas or certain chemicals come and get connected with the body of the carbon nanotube, it changes the electrical conductivity. But the electrical conductivity, how much it changes is very small, you would not be able to detect it. But now if you put in a gate over here, you can amplify the signal. So, that is why this type of design is used in any type of sensors you are making it, because you are not only getting a change, but you are getting the effect you are amplifying. These type of transistors, those are the ones which are present, are mostly in used, these are used for not for actually amplifying it gradually. These FET transistors are used more as switching things on and off. So, even in an electronic circuit, when you write in a computer or something, there are a number of switches which are turning on and off, on and off. Then none of them are mechanical switches. These ones are, how do you turn it off? If you put the gate as more negative, you can almost squeeze the channel to almost 0, and then this would be turned off, and then they'll be turned on. So, there is also another type of FET is known as MOSFET, metal oxide semiconductor. There is an oxide layer deposited on top of it. We will talk about that. So, the carbon nanotubes are being used, and they are trying to. So, what are these graphs over here? This graph is you are measuring the current as the source and drain voltage. So, going back, so you are measuring the current that is flowing through here as you are changing the voltage between the source and drain. But why there are so many graphs over here? Because each graph talks about a different gate voltage. So, you see if the gate voltage is minus 0.9, then you change your source and drain a little bit, you get an amplification, you get more of the current that would flowing in over here. As the gate voltage comes closer to the 0, this is. So, if you are trying to use it as a depend upon what you would be using it as a switch or the other places. So, here with this transistor they are trying to use, they call it SWNT FET. So, this is their IV characteristics of the transistor, which is not an ideal FET, but an FET where you have used the carbon nanotube as your channel. So, this is the CNT. Now, there are two, the one which I showed right now, there is a drawback of this design. When you make it the source and drain, and this it is the gate is underneath it. So, there could be two ways of making the gate. There could be gate which is below it, that is known as bottom gate, or the gate could be on the top, that is top gate. So, these are the CNT transistors where the nanotube has been put over here inside and we put the gate on the top. There have been reports which says on the bottom, as see the top gated CNT FET outperforms the best silicon devices. So, if you put your nanotube in between over here, it performs lot better than the silicon transistors. Why? Because you are using the nanotube just as a path, as a channel of getting the electrons or holes from the source to the gate, and by applying the gate earlier you leave it to the open path. It is just a two dimensional array, the electrons are traveling over there, path of that might get lost as it goes, but now you have restricted it and put them all inside a channel, and then by applying the voltage you can squeeze or you can get the channel out. So, you have basically get the losses, and that is what this result shows. This is the diagram which I showed before. This is the bottom gated. So, if you have the CNT on the bottom, this also has the similar feature, but the top gate is the where you have the gate on the top. That means you have the carbon nanotube on the top connected, that would be the better performing device. So, now if you can, one of the places where you can use carbon nanotubes is you connect two transistors together. When you look, here the purpose of that was making transistors into what we call as logic gates. In a transistor circuit, what transistors uses, they use it as a logic gate. So, you use two transistors, one is an N channel FET and the other, the N and P means what is flowing through the holes. Is it the electrons flowing or the holes flowing? Again, the holes flowing, that means nothing, the holes are not flowing that direction, that means it is the minus of, that means most electrons are moving on the other side. So, these diagrams. So, this person Fodion Avoris, he is the pioneer of doing from IBM. He has done a lot of research in trying to get. So, he found that the N channel one, when it is exposed to the oxygen, and this transistor, when this carbon nanotube is exposed to the oxygen or exposed not to the oxygen, there is a big change. You see over here, this is the plot of the gate voltage as the function of the current, and so as it changes, you can be using it to measure the sensing. We can. So, carbon nanotubes, this is another way has been used to make again that has more biological significance. So, this is carbon nanotubes as a Schottky barrier transistors. What is a Schottky barrier? Again, we have a source and the drain, and you have the carbon nanotube over here, and then you have the ground plane. So, what you are measuring is the conductance. Do you know how conductance is measured? It is just the opposite of resistance. Okay. So, it is V. So, the conductance as a function of the gate voltage. So, as you see what happens as with the length of the carbon nanotube. So, here we have the top gate, the channel goes in over here, and again why are we using the carbon nanotube? We are making the channels better, but then by doing that, if we can also make it into as we say as a sensing device, because the properties of the carbon nanotubes change as they get exposed to other devices. So, this is again another type of transistor. This is the source. So, we what they have studied is, again you put the carbon nanotube in between the forward gate and the back gate. You are measuring the current and with the gate voltage, and so they are studying the scaling of in carbon nanotube. That means, when you take carbon nanotubes, put it with different diameter, different dimensions, how much of this changes. These again I do not think what's okay. Let us talk about okay. Now, one problem among all these transistors, the one which we discussed here, is this carbon nanotube what you put in over here. Carbon nanotube can be semiconductor as well as metallic. So, how do you guarantee that the transistor that you have put in over here, if it is metallic, then your transistor is not going to work. This has to be semiconducting only, then your transistor is going to work. So, this paper talks about how you can use an array of transistors, and so they have a selective growth mechanism. We also know from the previous slide that the nanotube behavior, metallic or semiconductor, depends upon the diameter of the carbon nanotubes. So, if you can control the diameter of the carbon nanotubes, then you can make sure that they are semiconductor or metal. So, this paper they have used a template where we have, and you can vary the diameter of the carbon nanotubes, and then you could make it go into drain, source, and you can have a total array of a number of transistors working. So, this paper talks about transistors made of multi-wall. Again, we found out that single wall nanotubes have issues. The main issues is you would be able to know whether it is a semiconductor or metal. These people tried to make the transistor with multi-wall carbon nanotubes. What is the electronic property of multi-wall carbon nanotube? I discussed it over there, it is always metallic. There is no semiconducting multi-wall carbon nanotube, but then a transistor is not going to work. So, they make the transistor with metallic carbon nanotube, and they have this particular compound C, which makes it, by varying these, they can make it into semiconducting material. So, this is what they are. So, this is the carbon nanotube with the. So, they have been succeeding in making a transistor with multi-wall carbon nanotube. That was the main idea with, and by changing this from a nitrogen, if you change it to another compound, they can make the transistor from a p type to an n type. We talked about the p pods before. So, we are trying to make carbon nanotube based molecular. So, if these things these are the Bucky balls, as they move in through the carbon nanotube, they deform. how do you measure how much it? You can do it if this carbon nanotube is used as a contact between your source and the drain. So, as it goes in over here, this creates some charge changes. So, these are images which shows those things are moving in over here. So, as it partially gets in over here, you would be able to measure. So, this is what is known as the molecular electronics. One of the reason why we are trying to move into carbon compared to silicon is we want what is known as flexible electronics. Silicon based system are made on silicon wafer, it is rigid. If we kind of try to interact it with the human body or any biological organ, we need flexible. So, if you can use carbon nanotube based things, carbon is first of all absorbed to the body and it is flexible. So, you can make flexible. There are polymers which are used for making electronics. I think you must have seen there are current screens or laptops which you can fold, you can roll it like a piece of paper. So, there they have the same, they are again polymer based, you can make it with carbon nanotubes. If you want to interface an electronic device with the biological system, you would like to make it into flexible systems. So, there are more pictures. This is a theoretical paper which talks about the carbon nanotube. So, if you take carbon nanotube transistors and you dope the nanotubes, again doping the nanotube means if you are adding something else with it, what happens to the properties. Okay, so that is all I wanted to talk about today. Any questions about this? The main idea which I wanted to bring through all this is how the carbon nanotube is used as an FET transistor and how it can be used for detecting. There can be different modes, different modules of how you can design, you can make it, you can either make it bottom gate or you can make it top gate. The advantage of having bottom or top is wherever your sample is exposed. Now, if you have it in the top gate configuration, then you have to pass your sample through the transistor, because you have your gate on the top, your carbon nanotube here, your source and drain connections. So, you have to pass your sample over through here, and that is when the changes would be. If it is bottom gate, your nanotube is just sitting here, it is exposed. So, you can expose. So, if you are trying to make it as, but the performance of a top gate sensor is, as we found out, is better than that of a bottom gate. Then there were other ways. What we can find out is if you can get this nanotube under stress or under other things, like if you pass something through the carbon nanotubes, as the material moves, you can change what is it, what as the material is moving, it is changing the gate, the channel, and as the channel moves, you would be able to measure it, and from there you would be able to detect how far along the carbon nanotube something has moved.
Sir, are there any healthcare applications?
Yes, as I said, as sensing applications. Healthcare means you need to.
I meant to say that artificial kidney or most mask likewise, any such kind of.
The healthcare application, as I said, is you are trying to sense certain, that sensing thing could be you are trying to sense an infection, or you could be able to sense if your that we would talk about when we talk about sensors, is anything that happens on the body of the carbon nanotube. Okay.
I am talking about curing, sir. Any curing of diseases like that.
Oh, you are talking about therapeutics, how to cure. No, this does not, this helps to monitor. Okay. So, the idea is you would be able to monitor, say if you have this device, you could be able to monitor your blood sugar level or all throughout 24 hours. So, as if you make a device like this, implant it, you would be, as the sugar increases, again I do not know, with blood sugar there has been no result, but there are other experiments where whatever comes in and gets deposited on top of the carbon nanotubes, you would be able to detect it. So, that is it. No, for at least for the transistor mode there is no therapeutic. For therapeutic, I think they talked about for cancer, if you put carbon nanotubes inside, then you would be able to kill the cancer cells. The other ways of using carbon nanotubes is, other than sensors, the other way is carbon nanotubes mechanical properties. You can use mechanical properties and use it as stents. You know, when you are joining blood vessels and all, you can, carbon nanotube has excellent property where it could be used. We'll talk about that when we talk about the nano medicine. It actually forms good scaffolds. So, if you are trying to join, if you are trying to make artificial organ to a real organ, you would like to need scaffold. That is where we would talk when we talk about nanomedicine. That is where carbon nanotubes comes in. Carbon nanotube matrices have been used for cell culture. If you grow a cell, you grow it on a substrate. You normally grow it on glass or grow it on certain. So, carbon nanotubes have been able to be a better substrate for going for keeping cells alive longer or doing structure. Yeah, that we would talk about when we do our nanomedicine. Okay. Now, this transistor one is only related to sensing.
Among all these examples you have cited in that research papers, this is I mean, only the flexible component is that carbon nanotube only, right? All the FET systems that you have discussed, majority of them are grown over the silicon oxide layer itself.
Yes, that is right. Right now, the flexible component here is the carbon nanotube. The source and drain are still metallic, but there are reports where people have been able to dope that area of the carbon nanotube. So, they built the entire transistor out of carbon nanotube. So, the source and drain have been also areas of when I did not talk about graphene. So, when we use that, you can have maybe use graphene on something and make these things also, you can make it flexible. Not on these papers though.
Such I mean typical experimental component that is overall when we are taking it, there is no flexibility.
These ones no. These ones the only here flexibility is not the issue. Here their main issue was to find better performance of the transistor. So, that is why they used the carbon nanotube to do that. Flexibility was not. Carbon nanotube is flexible, that is right, but that is, as you said, that is the only
source and drain are different.
Source and drain are still made on silicon wafer.
And
yes.
The basic platform is also silicon.
Yeah, the gate is also silicon. Yes, so the gate is actually metallic. So, source and drain and gate is aluminum or something. It's metallic. So, yes, but it's very thin film. It's not, but it's still it's not flexible. Yes.
And what is the promise of using multiple carbon nanotubes over this thing? Because all these experimental concepts are providing only one nanotube, right? Source and drain are connected only with a,
yes.
whether it may be a single or multi-wall nanotubes, it is only one. There is only one.
That is right. This paper talks about how you would be connecting multiple of them. So, you can template it, and because you know these, to make this is a very difficult process. You have to take one carbon nanotube, try to place it between the source and the drain. So,
why so in order to make it the experimental simplicity, it is like that, or normally these FET systems are only having one?
These FET systems, there only people have done it, and there's none of them is commercially available, or people have not been able to make large scale. Yes, these are currently only in the experimental scale. The idea is people would be able to Right now lithography, silicon lithography has been developed so much, people are trying to use silicon lithography and using carbon nanotube, but if we change our whole fabrication process, then it might be helpful in doing that. I think I mentioned it there was one project where I was not a project, I was an external examiner to a candidate PhD. So he was using magnetotactic bacteria to bring the carbon nanotube and place it in between the source and the drain. So normally you use atomic force microscope. So he had a number of source and drains placed over there. He had the magnetic bacteria. He actually had to put a coat of some nutrition materials on top of the carbon nanotubes that would attract the bacteria. So once the bacteria latched onto the carbon nanotube, he would apply a magnetic field that would make the bacteria move and then place the carbon nanotube, but he had issues of after placing the bacteria did not release the carbon nanotube. So again they would have to work on how to get the magnetotactic bacteria. They wanted to kill the magnetotactic bacteria and keep the place over there. So that was one of the places where he was using biology to kind of to get this type of transistors.
Yeah, you told in yesterday's lecture after by radiating with some UV light or something.
Yes.
Laser.
Yes, yes. You can kill the bacteria, but it wasn't working working the way as it was promised. Okay. Because you would want them to bring it over there, and when they will be killing it, but when they were dying, the nanotube orientation, because they were all stuck with the nanotube. So when they got killed, they may be the alignment was not all the transistors were working the way they are supposed to. But more research may be needed in doing that. Yes, placing the carbon nanotube is a big problem in these ones. Right, the current techniques what people use is atomic force microscope to kind of painstakingly take carbon nanotube and place it over there. There are other papers where they have grown a carbon nanotube using one of the synthesis techniques, again by using either molecular beam epitaxy or something. They have been able to grow one carbon nanotube in between the source and the drain. So that also works. So you can grow the carbon nanotube in between the source and the drain, and then that way is better than placing a carbon nanotube. One issue I did not discuss is contact. Placing a carbon nanotube does not guarantee it would make good contact with the source and the drain. So making contact is also another issue which is a big problem on this research. So you have to have some conducting material over there in the source, and it should be sticking over there. One of the reasons why most of these results have come out from only few groups is because they have the technique of making good contact. If you put the carbon nanotube between the source and the drain is fine, but it does not guarantee that it is going to be a transistor, because there might be a big insulation between the source and the nanotube and the drain and the nanotube. So the best way would be to grow the nanotube on top of the source and drain. If you can do that, then I think your electrical contact is, so you put the catalyst particles on the source and the drain and grow the carbon nanotube there. But none of these papers have done it, okay, because that is more difficult to do. Again, these are old papers. These are old, means they are all in the early 2000s. Right now the problem is people have moved on to graphenes. You know, carbon nanotube has issues of making contacts. If you make your transistors out of graphene, the contact issue is not there, because graphene is a flat material, so the contact, so that is why most of the research has moved on to graphene. I will talk about that also in the next class, next or maybe the following class. Yes. There activated carbon is carbon which is very reactive, but graphene is just one thin sheet of carbon. So activated carbon does not need to have the graphene structure. Okay. So I would not say there is anything similar between activated carbon and graphene, their properties are like totally different. Activated means they are only they are very reactive. Okay.
Very high surface area.
Yeah, very high surface area. That is what it makes it. One of the main applications of nanomaterials are as catalysts. The main reason they are used as catalysts is because of high surface area, so they can make the reaction work. Again, to answer your question, we would go in the nanomedicine, where we would talk more about carbon nanotubes as.
My idea is, why don't we develop like masks, where masks can prevent this pollution, all kinds of pollution.
Yes.
In the cities, there are many kinds of pollution, particularly air pollution.
Yes.
We have to prevent these contaminants at outside. Only pure air it should go inside in such a way that we have to prevent.
Yes. The main problem of that is, again, surface. If you make your holes nanotube very small, air is not going to flow through them, because they already have air in there. So maybe you can have a bundle where you have one nanotube, air may be flowing in between that, but that may not be sufficient. There are masks available which are for, I think, which prevent even small minute particles from getting.
It can separate only dust particles. I am talking about gases and all this.
Yes, there are different type of. There are methods by which, like chromatography. In chromatography, what you do is you separate particles depending upon how much they diffuse. So there are, you might be able to do that by using similar, by how much every gas has a different kinetic, different velocity. So maybe you would be able to differentiate. But main problem of anything small, making anything small, is you won't be able to keep the flow rate there. That is the big challenge of MEMS, is how you can keep the flow rate active as well as you can make the things small. Okay, any other? I will your molecular beam epitaxy question I can address as we. Any other question other than that? Again, you are welcome to ask me, as I will be outside. And tomorrow I have said the first part of the lecture was supposed to be introduction to molecular biology by using different type of molecular biological techniques, and then we would talk about how nanotechnology is used to kind of improve that. Again, how many of you are very familiar with molecular biology? It might be a repeat for you, that means regular techniques. Okay, so still there are a lot of students who would, I think, need the introduction to molecular biology. Okay, so again, the first part of the lecture you might find it was for people who already know it, might find it a little repetitive, but we would unless we know that, then we won't be knowing how nanotechnology would try to improve that or do it in a different way. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, participants, please wait, because putting that one Excel sheet